We're with Elaine Alexander, and this is February the 24th, and I'm Harvey Newman, and we're here to talk about Atlanta and the legacy of Ambassador Andrew Young in the city. We usually begin with a question that asks people, how did you connect with Atlanta? Were you born here? Did you come here? How did you get here?
I was born in Boston, raised in Boston, married in 1955, and we came to Atlanta then because my husband, who was going to be a lawyer and is now a lawyer, had decided what firm he wanted to be with, which was Kilpatrick Stockton, Townsend Stockton. Now the name has changed many times, and he's still with them. And so we came down here 5 days after we were married, and we were here for just a couple of months and then left while he was in the Air Force. Came back when I was pregnant with our first child in 1958. And that's when we really became residents of Atlanta. I had been teaching school in Boston. My husband had been teaching at Harvard Law School. And we came down here to start repopulating the city, which we did very nicely, thank you very much. And I just found Atlanta to be so welcoming. I wasn't used to that. In Boston, you would meet someone and they would ask you, of course, I was then 21 years old, they would ask you what your parents' name was, and then what were your grandparents' names, the whole thing. And here, you met someone and they said, where are you from? That was the only question. And admittedly, when we first came down here, my primary associations and contacts and involvement was with the Atlanta Jewish community. And as I became more comfortable in this environment, and we felt more a part of Atlanta, we became active, particularly, I think, active politically. And I think when I first met Andy and Maynard and that whole crew that were referred to as the Young Turks, was during Maynard Jackson's campaign for the Senate. And these were just people I really and truly liked.
Okay.
And they seemed to like me too. And the associations that I started making way back then, late 60s, around 70, I've maintained through today. And I was just very, very fortunate. The people, particularly the African American people that I met, were the people who had stars in their crowns already. But who knew?
Yeah.
And
so you were part of that early Senate race, and this was before his race for vice mayor, as I recall.
yes.
So that would have been his initial run for public office.
Was.
The attraction to Maynard's leadership qualities, how did you feel about him? I know in my own case, we were living in the suburbs out in DeKalb County, and I was going to school at Emory and working at Georgia State at the same time, and we found his personality so captivating we chose to move into the city in the early 70s.
Well, it's very interesting. The first time I met Maynard was at a DeKalb County Democratic Party or reception or fundraiser, I don't remember. And there was this big man there, and I said to my husband, who is that Oxford-sounding Puerto Rican? Don't think we haven't laughed about that a lot. And that's the first time I met Maynard. Miles had met him before. And that was a friendship and an association that lasted until Maynard's death. As a matter of fact, the last time I saw Maynard, was right here. He was sitting where you're sitting now, and I was probably sitting here. He had come up, we were to be interviewed together for a political ad for Shirley Franklin's campaign. And we had decided that the view of downtown, that we were going to be interviewed out on the balcony, and it never happened. I don't even remember who the interviewer was. She got caught in traffic on the expressway and never got here.
Never got here.
But these were just incredibly wonderful people, and because of my naivete, I never understood the racial tension, the whole concept of it. I really and truly didn't. It bothered me from the first time I was south. I was 9 years old with my parents and my brother in the obligatory trip to Washington, D.C. And we were taking a bus or a streetcar or something to Baltimore to see cousins. And there was a sign on the front of the bus that said, "White passengers sit from front, colored from back." And I asked my parents what that meant. And I can still remember both of them said, "Shh, Elaine, not so loud. It's just the way things are done down here." And here, at 9 years old, I was very disturbed about that. When they told me what it meant, I didn't even know what it meant, but it just struck me as being wrong. And at that time, I thought, well, I'm so glad I live in Boston and not Washington. Then ended up coming down here. But Atlanta was a very, very different place. We went to a dinner at the Biltmore in 1958 or 9 that was integrated, just slightly, vaguely, maybe 2 people. And we, of course, parked on the street because we couldn't afford a parking lot. And we were standing at the curb just before the Biltmore Hotel. And I looked up, and the Klan was picketing. And my reaction was so visceral, I threw up in the street. These were things that just did not happen before my eyes. I read about it in the paper and all of that. It was quite a reaction on my part. And I think I have probably maintained that feeling of just not understanding why white people think that black people aren't the same, and we don't look alike, but still the same. And it was because I asked all the questions that most other white people only thought about, I think, that made me so welcome in the African American, which wasn't leadership then, but became leadership.
Were you active in other political campaigns when Sam Massell?
Yeah, I supported, let's see, we weren't living in the city when Sam went down, I don't think we were. I was never active in Sam's campaign. I was active in Sidney Marcus's campaign against Andy. And Andy and Jean were the only 2 people that were even remotely nice to me about it. I mean, all of my other black acquaintances were very upset with me that I was supporting Sidney Marcus over Andy Young. It was very, very hard time. And that was when Maynard made a very unfortunate crack that it took me 3 years to start speaking to him again. A newscaster asked him about the blacks that were active in Sidney Marcus' campaign. Do you remember that?
Shuffling, grinning.
Grinning, shuffling niggers. And I mean, I just refused to speak to him. I couldn't stand it. But as I say, Andy was always very gentlemanly about it. When Andy ran for Congress, and we go pretty far back, when he ran for Congress, we had, I think, it may have been the first, I don't think it was the only, but it was close to the only house party for him.
And this was his first unsuccessful run. And then, I guess 2 years later, 74, ran again successfully that time.
Yes.
I wasn't terribly aware of all that at the time. I was living out in County, and
We had moved into the city by then.
we didn't move in, I think, until 77, I think, was the day we moved into Blanton Road over, not far from the horse fair, near Chastain. But this project has given me an opportunity to get to know Andy better in a different way. We tease about the policies that he supported while he was mayor. I tell him that I voted for him, but I didn't agree with his policies for about 8 years. But I loved his leadership, so I continued to support him. How did you find his leadership? How did he win you over, or how did you become back friends again after you'd supported him and then not supported him?
Oh, I'm trying to resurrect that. As I say, he had always been most kind to me, so there was never any discomfort when we saw each other.
Okay.
And I was crazy about Jane. She was absolutely wonderful. And I'm trying to think if I did anything. Oh, I know. The first time I got really angry with Andy after he was elected mayor, I had been involved in the Atlanta CRC, the Civil Rights Commission, and for many, many years. And Joe Roberts and I had co-chaired it for most of Maynard's last term. And we had both been on it for years. And Andy wiped it out of the budget. Joe and I tried to keep it going, just the two of us. And that didn't work. We'd end up splitting the cost of a mailing, and then when people realized it didn't have the word I'm looking for,
Official sanction.
the sanction of City Hall, they became less interested in it. And Joe and I were interested in what it was supposed to accomplish.
That's an interesting point, because in talking with him, he views that Community Relations Commission as his bridge from civil rights activist to public official, because he was appointed by Mayor Massell.
Yes.
And Mayor Massell takes credit for
As well he should.
bringing this radical civil rights leader into the public service.
And of course Maynard had appointed me, and that's how I got started in it.
But then when he became mayor, he
Cut it
attempted
out of the budget. Hello, my dear.
There
I'm
she
so
is.
sorry.
Oh,
There's just too many things going on.
I know that. Would you like some iced tea or water?
Oh, water would be great. This is lovely.
Oh,
Wow,
thank
look at
you,
this.
thank you. We've been here 11 years, and I must tell you, I love it more every day.
Yeah, I can imagine. This is phenomenal.
Good afternoon.
Hi, how are you? Look at this skyline. And
Oh, yes.
I told her
that's why
this
we
must
did this
be
apartment.
Yeah.
Magnificent at night.
Yeah.
All the lights.
Yeah, it is so great. And you got, unless they put a Bank of America tower on top of Phipps Plaza,
Well, you know, this
it
is,
was secure.
Andrea, it's really funny that you should say that, because when before the building was complete, and I came up here. Have you changed your mind? Would you like
Oh,
some?
no, no, fine.
Um,
Where do you
When-
want to be, Harvey?
I think I'm probably pretty good.
You don't
right
need a
now.
plug?
Let's see. I got the long cord now.
oh,
So we go through this whole
We
thing.
know each other's.
'Cause we have multiple devices, which
yes.
has proved to be very helpful.
well, that's what they say.
Because we sometimes
Okay, there's
we
a
have a
plug
backup
around
plan.
there.
I'm just looking, let's see, that's like Monarch Plaza.
Wait to see the IBM tower was.
Oh boy, our students are going to be really
No,
jealous.
I was looking right here in the foreground.
Oh, in the foreground. Well, when I came up here and I was looking for what I wanted to be, I said, I want the downtown view, must have the downtown skyline, and I have to be taller, and it has to be higher than the Ritz-Carlton, which is right there, and that's 23 stories, and we're 31.
Okay.
So this is why we are in the building.
And you also have sort of an elevation. Your property is a little bit
Yes, it
higher
is a
too
little-
than the
it is.
Ritz-Carlton, right?
My wife was in that building, the Monarch
Monarch
Plaza,
building, yeah.
for many years, and we watched so many, after the MARTA station at Lenox opened, all of the high-rise buildings in the area.
Oh, I've watched
went up,
that. I've watched them. I think
And then she moved
still
over
around.
to Buckhead Plaza
Oh, yes.
when it opened.
What does she do?
She was an investment banker. She started out as a legal assistant in public finance at King & Spalding. And
I've
she,
heard of that.
Nice little local firm.
Yeah.
small local firm. But she stayed with them for 15 years in public finance and learned the business of public finance, and then went with Dean Witter when they were headquartered over there. Then eventually opened her own firm in the Buckhead Plaza building. So she did that for many years. Oh, that's
These are just hot off the press.
okay.
Sunday, May
Save
20th.
the date, May 20. I'm not going to be able to come to that. I'm going to be in Europe.
Well, that means you just have to
Lucky
work
you.
extra hard on the April 16th event.
I understand I'm on the program for that.
Well, the real thing is because we're doing a program with Georgia State and Jim Clifton, who's written this book, The Coming Jobs War. He's the president of Gallup, and
Oh,
he
that's
says
where
when
I've
you
heard the name.
distill all of the data and research about what people want, what people are thinking, it's
Yeah.
all about a job, which is defined as 30 hours a week and a livable income. And that's at the seat of a lot of this unrest. You've had this explosion of, young people
Yep.
and urbanization and so. So the school's observation of his birthday will be, this kind of a conversation, really looking at the policy implications of the quality economic growth, which also feeds into why we're doing this, is sort of what has been.
Is that going to be local view?
This will be
thing?
in, that's one of the things we need to sort of shape the questions, and we talk some about who should help to moderate that, and so, because the school now includes economics, public policy, public management, and policy, which is Harvey is chair of, social work and criminal justice. So it really has a lot of the.
It does. I didn't realize social work was in there.
Just since.
Just joined July 1,
Really?
but it's been a good
Yeah.
addition.
Yeah.
Enjoying working with those colleagues. We got started.
Oh,
We've
okay.
got all the forms signed.
Okay.
And we've asked the obligatory, how did you get to Atlanta question.
Oh, no, I missed that one?
Yes, she
Oh.
came here from Boston.
Okay, very good. So have we gotten to sort of how she got involved in the city?
We're getting to
Okay.
that.
Okay.
Her engagement with Maynard Jackson and your father.
Okay.
And she supported Sidney Marcus and your father.
And your parents were the only ones who were nice to me. I mean it. I honestly mean it.
So did we talk some about Maynard Jackson?
Some.
And what that
Some.
was like in the city?
Well, and this, Harvey, I didn't mention to you. I think when I first jumped feet first out of the Jewish community and into the general, i.e. African American community, it was a very, very interesting happening. I was on the leadership track in the Atlanta Jewish Federation, and we had a leadership retreat, and a speaker came in from New York, of course, always from New York, and at the end of the day, he said, to assure leadership in the Jewish community, you have to look around and see if anybody you know is capable of doing the job you're doing. And if so, it's time for you to move up the ladder, which was a very interesting concept, except I didn't take it that way. I took it knowing that dozens of people could do what I was doing, but invariably at most black events, I was one of the only white people there, and surely the only Jewish person there. And so that's when I decided that this is where I wanted to focus. That very night, Maynard called me and asked me to co-chair his inauguration. I'd worked on the campaigns. And that's when I realized this is what I wanted to do, because I knew that I wasn't a dime a dozen. I think that probably is the very conceited take on that.
So what was that sort of atmosphere like? Because Maynard, it was a new thing. It was a
Well,
change of the guard. And
as I told Harvey, I started in Maynard's campaigns when I first met your parents, when he ran for the Senate. So I go back. And there also was something very interesting, and this is interesting to no one but me, but the campaign was, of course, during the summer. And during the summer, this skin gets very dark, very, very dark. And I was meeting people for the first time. And because it was Maynard Jackson's Senate campaign office, and I was there, the assumption was that I was African American. And that is something I did not realize how widespread that was. And I've had many, many funny experiences with people who refused to believe that I was white. Always black people think I'm black, which is interesting. And I have always taken that as a huge compliment.
yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. And so I became friendly with that group of people, and the only one that had any real antagonism toward me when she found out that I wasn't black was Jan Douglas. She was really mad. She thought I was trying to pull the wool over everybody's eyes.
So is that why you were supporting Maynard? You supported Maynard against myself?
Yeah. I supported Maynard against Herman Talmadge. And Sam was not at all happy with me. And the majority of the Jewish community. I got a lot of calls. But I just thought Maynard would be a better mayor than Sam had been.
What did you see? What did you see in Maynard? What did you see in Maynard that?
He was atypical of what I thought the majority of the white community expected. And he was such a deliberate thinker. He was more deliberate then than he was toward the end of his life. He kind of shot his mouth off a little bit too often. But I just knew that he would bring a passion to the mayor's office that had never been there before. And I had absolutely no trouble in being very open in my support. And I won't say I lost any friends over it because I lost good feelings from a lot of people, but no friends.
Making, I think, a very important point that Andrea probably ought to hear about your role. Maynard appointed you to the Community
CRC.
Relations Commission. So she was part of that organization.
Joe Roberts and I chaired it.
That your father had been a part of.
Early on.
Had
during
been
Sam's.
key in his transition from civil rights leadership to public leadership. And then when he became mayor,
He cut it out of the budget.
Yes, I know.
I couldn't either. Joe and I tried to keep it going, but without the sanction of City Hall, nobody cared to come. If they didn't have a chance, maybe seeing the mayor, they weren't interested in coming to any meetings. And they knew that we had no power to do anything.
So at the time, so you were still co-chairs at the time, at the
We were.
transition? And Jan was the executive director, wasn't she? Jan Douglas?
Might very well have still been.
How did you see the role that the CRC played during Maynard's administration?
Well, at the beginning, it gave people a place to vent, citizens a place to vent. And they knew that they could air their complaints and their concerns. And here was a group of people appointed by the mayor who was going to look into them. And that's what we did. It was the people that we used to. We met in the big meeting room on the far right before going to the old city council chamber. And there used to be standing room only in that room. And people would talk about school bus routes, everything, absolutely everything. But the citizens of Atlanta felt better about it, knowing that there was some place that they could come to vent. We had no subpoena power, no power, nothing at all. But we would look into some things, and I'm trying to think, he was a lawyer, John, and there was something we were supposed to look into at a grocery store, and he was adamant that I not go. And it's a good thing because they ended up dodging bullets. John and one other man from the commission went, and I was, no place for you, girl.
So he was a commission member. Did Maynard, were there some policy things that came out of the hearings?
I doubt it. I really don't think there were. It had a lot of unfulfilled potential. And at the beginning, when it was first started, I think the commission did have subpoena power. And I don't remember when that was ended.
So in terms of the people complaining, well, maybe Obama needs a community relations commission for all these Tea Party people to complain to.
Oh, he's got better things to do this time.
Was it mostly the African American citizenry that used
Well,
it?
it was mostly African American, and it was mostly lower income people. Got a lot of taxi driver stuff. Oh, I knew more about the taxi cab commission than I ever wanted to.
I think as city government changed and more appointments were made and people with taxi cab complaints could go to that taxi cab bureau more easily, that the work of the commission diminished, or did it stay fairly important and consistent level?
Well, as soon as subpoena power was taken away, the commission was so badly diminished that it was just a place to come and bitch. And occasionally some of us would go out and check on things, more than just occasionally. I take that back because I spent several hours at Georgia Power one time when there were allegations of discrimination there. And we got the gravitas because we were part of the administration.
So the subpoena power was taken away by the mayor, or was there some
I think it was,
court case?
it may have been during Sam's term. We never had it. When I was on the commission, we never had subpoena power. But we used to do things when they complained about the license review board or something. A couple of us would go to the license review board meeting to see if that in fact had happened. One particular meeting I remember going to, and big coincidence, my husband was chair of the license review committee for almost all of Maynard's terms. And there was something there was an attitude from one of the members that I became very sensitive to after hearing the complaints in the CRC meeting. And I spoke to that member, and I spoke to my husband about it.
Did you ever involve the court system or the police?
The police occasionally, but not the court system, while I was on the commission at least.
You talked about Leadership Atlanta at all?
No,
Okay. So you were involved in...
I was a member of the class in 1976, and my class was 77, and shortly after I finished the year, that's when I was working for Maynard, I was what we called me Special Projects Coordinator. In other words, if a conference was coming into Atlanta and they needed somebody to do the logistics, I did that. The Organization of American States, the National Mayors came in, and I headed that up, and it was wonderful. I mean, I was doing what I was good at and thoroughly enjoyed it. As a matter of fact, the National Conference of Mayors was probably my high point in that part of my career, because I raised money and I went around, I wanted to get money from all the people you wanted to get money from for something like that. I raised a lot of money and I didn't spend all of it. And I talked Maynard into letting me return the money that hadn't been spent, prorated to the contribution. Well, I did that with an accompanying letter. The reaction was phenomenal. I mean, even if C&S Bank got $300 back, they got it back. That had never happened before. So that was very good PR for Maynard. But before I go into Leadership Atlanta, I also want to say that when I first started working at City Hall, and I was like a camp follower until I got kind of an official title in an office. I went up there 3 days a week as a volunteer and just did things that had to be done. And I became very familiar up there to everybody. And I remember Jerry Elder, who was Maynard's secretary, came to me one day with tears rolling, handed me a Western Union telegram. I will never forget this. Maynard, and it said, doo-dah, doo-dah, all the doo-dah day. And I mean, I just thinking about it, I fill up. It was so horrible. Maynard used to have me call bank presidents and chair of boards saying, this is Elaine Alexander, so-and-so there, and get them on the phone and say, hi, how are you? Here, the mayor wants to speak to you. Because they wouldn't take his calls. I swear to you, they would not take Maynard's calls. It's just horrifying. Because they didn't want a black man to be mayor of their city. I will never forget the atmosphere there. It was just terrible. And then gradually the business people came around because they're altruistic after all.
Missing and murdered children's crisis helped shift the climate of business opinion as everybody's sort of faced with common objective.
It may have. I don't know. I don't have an opinion on that. Interesting concept, but I've never even thought of it in that light. But okay, now with Leadership Atlanta.
And do you remember when it was getting started? And
1970.
What the motivation for it was?
The motivation was, and this is this is something that has been misstated with great consistency over the years. The motivation was when, can't remember, head of the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce at that time.
Opie Shelton.
It was Opie. Oh, you're right. No, I'm happy, yes. He made it very clear that they had to do things, made it very clear to his board, that they had to create some innovative programming. And was it John Carter, Jack Carter? They had a Carter Company, was president at the time. And he heard about this innovative program in Philadelphia that was called the Philadelphia Lecture Series. And they picked people to participate and go to lectures once a month. And then there was somebody who was at the University of Georgia on the faculty who thought it would be an ideal way to bring people together to introduce future leaders in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And that was the genesis of it. And it was started as a program, the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, and Ivan Allen III was the chair of the Chamber's Committee on New Programs and Outreach. So essentially, Ivan Allen III started Leadership Atlanta. And it was, the concept was, because Atlanta was growing so quickly, that you couldn't pick up the phone in 5 minutes, call all the mover and shakers. Because first of all, there were too many, and secondly, most people didn't know them. So they decided to start this program called Leadership Atlanta, the Atlanta Leadership Development Foundation. And they would bring together various leaders. Well, Isabel Gates Webster was the only woman in the first class. And I think Eldridge McMillan and somebody else, other two blacks in the first class. And they were not, I mean, they thought they were doing a wonderful job making it very diverse. By the time I applied in 1976, I think there were, maybe the fifth of the class was female. And there were a few blacks, but not very many. And then in 1978, I said 56, I meant 76. In 1978, the executive director resigned, and I had had lunch with a dear friend of mine who was with CNN at the time, and she said, Elaine, you've got to get something definite going. I mean, you go from political campaign to political campaign, and when Maine needs you, you do this, you do that. She said, you've got to really do something. Is there any job in the city of Atlanta that you think you could do better than it's being done? And I thought for about 2.5 seconds and said I could do a much better job of Leadership Atlanta than it's being done. She happened to be in that year's Leadership Atlanta class. The first thing she heard when she got to the fall retreat was that the executive director had resigned. So she marched herself up to chairman of the Board of Trustees, and she said, Elaine Alexander wants the job. So I was essentially interim or pro tem executive director for a year, and then this too was very interesting. They asked my recommendations. They wanted me to be full-time executive director and CEO. Still had 2 children at home. The oldest 2 had left college, but still had 2 at home. And I know that wasn't going to work, and I said I drew out a plan for them, all the different options they could follow to get the leadership of the organization in place. And surprisingly enough, they accepted my plan that said co-executive directors, 1 black and 1 white. And that was not an easy pill for them to swallow. The first question I got was, do you know any black who could do it? I said, yes, I did. As a matter of fact, I had already spoken to her, and that, of course, was Myrtle Davis. And she was just going out as the first black president of the League of Women Voters for Atlanta, Fulton County. And I asked her if she'd be interested in a part-time job. And she said she would. So then the next question the Board of Trustees asked me was, well, what if you and this Myrtle Davis have a fight? And I looked at this man, who I didn't know very well, but I certainly knew his law firm very well, and knew many of his partners. I said, well, what if you and one of his partners have a fight? He said, well, we don't fight. I said, do you think we will because we're girls? Well, that just flummoxed them. They couldn't do anything but give me what I wanted, and that's what I wanted. And Myrtle and I were co-executive directors for 10 years. And then she left, and I stayed on for a couple more years after that. And that changed the image of Leadership Atlanta, that something I felt desperately needed to be done. Because at that time, the Chamber of Commerce was pretty much all white, with the grudging acceptance of Herman and Jesse occasionally. And we had also become independent. We were no longer a program of the Chamber of Commerce. And it was interesting and wonderful for me to be able to look at something like Leadership Atlanta with a diversity lens. And I don't move off of things that I think are important very easily. And people kept saying, Elaine, you talk too much. And in the trustees meeting, I'd be talking about something they were talking about that I shouldn't have been talking about. And one of them would look at me and say, oh, stop equivocating. Because I knew the way I wanted things to be. And I really do think that shaped Leadership Atlanta.
Is that when you moved, the Leadership Atlanta moved to having pretty much parity, or pretty close to parity, of black and white?
Developed the selection process so that you'd be diverse professions and vocations.
Profit, nonprofit, education.
Government, education, social service, law, banking. I mean, we had graphs, and that was all done. We had the different categories on top, and we had squares under each: white male, black male, white female, black female, and we put the names of the applicants. So first thing we saw was where they fell in their professions. And the goal was to have a balanced class.
And that model has, how did Leadership Atlanta change sort of what came out of Philadelphia? Because that started off as just a lecture series.
Yes, we just developed. And there was a Leadership Savannah program that had started, probably like 10 years before we did. And it sounds ridiculous to say it, particularly since half my soul is in Savannah anyway. But I guess they started in about 65, so it was 5 years before. It was a program for white males, and after 3 years they ran. So they decided to take a hiatus, which they did. So that makes Leadership Atlanta and the Philadelphia Leadership Lecture. Leadership Atlanta is the oldest leadership development association. And while I was with Leadership Atlanta, called constantly for advice from other leadership programs or chambers of commerce that wanted to start them. And we would advise. I got one from Australia, one from Scotland, and I gave them guidance. They would call with questions, and we had things that only from experience could we develop. Networking, among alumni that have available contact information for, well, now it's over 2000. Say, with all of my advising and the starting of new programs, it was my diversity lens that they found out about.
My class is very active. So.
What year were you?
I did it when I came back to Atlanta, so I was...
Oh, yours was, you had a 5-year reunion last?
Did I miss a 5-year reunion?
I think it was last night. Was Lynn Siegel in your class?
No.
No.
We'll be next year, 2013.
Oh,
We'll be next year. So
she had a reunion last
so it was
night.
a great, yeah, so I think it's been a phenomenal program.
Oh, it has been. It's absolutely wonderful. I've got so many warm, fuzzy stories about Leadership Atlanta. I think that probably my favorite is Bill Bowling. When he first decided that he wanted to have a food bank in Atlanta, he was literally standing on the street with his hat in his hand, begging for dollars to pay for a delivery of something. And I wish I could remember, it may have been Larry, one of the members of Leadership Atlanta. He didn't want to waste his time. He was very, very reluctant. And we worked on him and got him to agree to do it. And by the middle of the year, he came up to me and he said, "Elaine, you were so right. Now, if I need sudden emergency funds, all I have to do is," and I know the people at the bank, I know the people in the law office, and he said, "This has been phenomenal." And then, when I read in the paper a few years later that he planned to take it statewide, I called him, and I gave him the names and the phone numbers of all the Leadership Atlanta alumni in the different cities he was going to. So I would say, go to Albany and call this one, go to Macon and call that one. I didn't think we would be talking about Leadership Atlanta. Well, before my time, Skip Alsas was in one of the first classes. He was in about 72 or 73. And he had discovered a newborn test that could be performed on newborn infants for a matter of pennies a baby, that would diagnose the potential for some kind of brain damage or it wasn't learning disability, it was something else. And he couldn't get states to take it seriously. So a few of his classmates, Don Chapman, Tom Asher, a few of his classmates got together and they started making calls to people they knew all over the country and told them about this wonderful, inexpensive test that could be performed on newborns. And the states that adopted it in their legislation were in the double digits. I don't remember how many, but just that year. Now I think all states require it. And then, there are different organizations that really got strengthened in their early years because of that dog, if I could find it.
Separation from the Chamber of Commerce. When did that take place and under what circumstances?
It took place in 1976, and the circumstances were the chamber wanted to get the expense of the program off their books. And Frank Robinson was he was the program director, executive director, and he thought that he would be able to raise enough money independently to keep the program going. And so it was very good. We still rented office space from them in the Omni for many years. So it was certainly a very friendly and pleasant separation. But the chamber's feeling was they never meant for this to be an ongoing program. It was to be a...
They didn't intend for it to, they weren't originally trying to sort of create something and then spin it off?
That's what they said, yeah.
You know, my dad had this idea that somehow there's some sort of relationship between the Action Forum and Leadership Atlanta.
They were started about the same time, but there wasn't really, I think a lot of the same people may have been involved. I know the Action Forum got funding from the Trust Company Bank, if I remember correctly, and A.B. Paget was in charge of the corporate contribution aspect from Trust Company, and he was also on the Leadership Atlanta Board of Trustees. So that might be the tie-in that your dad is thinking about.
Talking about A.B. in a while.
Nobody has. he was something else.
He was an amazing man.
What about the Woodruff Foundation? Was it supportive?
I don't remember ever going to the Woodruff Foundation funds. Not for Leadership Atlanta. We didn't, because when I came on, they hadn't collected dues or tuition from people, bills over $600, and so there was a lot of work to be done, up to and including people who hadn't paid last year's tuition, being contacted by phone to get the money in. But we did not get all that much in corporate concontributions. The volunteer commitment from participants in the alumni has always been extraordinary. Now, of course, they have a lot of corporate funding.
But it was the dues and tuition and volunteer.
There wasn't an alumni association when I came in.
What pushed you to initiate that?
Money. It would be a resource. And I knew the alumni all wanted the handbook.
Right.
And I knew they would pay for that, nothing else. So I decided, and I did decide this on my own. Everybody said, you can't do that, you can't do that. Well, I did it. That if they didn't join the Alumni Association and pay dues, they wouldn't get a handbook.
They were getting a handbook without paying dues?
Oh, yeah. And a handbook was sent out with every application.
Really?
Yes. Until the year I came on board. And I said, well, you can't afford the postage on that. And then the day before the applications were due, we had 24 applicants. Something that has such potential. It's down the drain, it's finished, it's over. And then the day the applications were due, in hundreds were hand-delivered. Catalog in the mail with the application, letter of appointment, or nomination.
Yeah. Got that, then you don't need to, you almost don't need to go through the program. Although, it is a very... Add the experiential component or some of the other more topical days?
No, the programs always had a topic. To show just how naive we were, we decided we were going to have a program on women's issues. This was, they knew if we told the participants it was going to be on women's issue, no, but the women would come. They would take that as their excused absence. So, what did we call it? Something surprise. Something. But we wouldn't tell anybody what the topic was. And then we realized that we didn't have to keep it secret. And it was such a successful program because men were educated, and back then they had nothing.
I get a little confused as an outsider looking at Leadership Atlanta. There's an LEAD program?
Yes, that's for the younger
Younger
people. Lead program, yeah. About after my time.
They had a retreat up at Berry College, road races, but I still am kind of a stranger to that.
I don't like the mountains. I just don't like them.
Attached to Savannah.
So with, did you talk some about my dad's time?
Of course, I always knew people in the, Shirley Franklin and I had become friendly during Maine Senate campaign and remained so. and I co-chaired her campaigns for mayor. I think probably the fact that I was working, still had 2 children at home and a huge, ridiculous, that when your dad was, I didn't have as much contact with your dad when he was mayor as I did when he was in Congress and in the UN.
Happening in it.
Well, it was constantly evolving. Miles said something to me just last night when I told him y'all were coming. He said, I think you should tell Andrea about the family picnic. And I had completely forgotten about that. There was a farewell family picnic for your dad when he left to be the UN ambassador. And Miles remembers it vividly because your dad and your brother and Miles and his 2 oldest sons and a lot of other people were playing basketball together. And Miles had one of these epiphanies looking around, hey, nowhere but Atlanta could this happen.
Where was it?
I don't remember where the picnic was. It was probably the waterworks. Most of the picnics were out there. I don't remember though.
Diversity.
The diversity of it,
Yeah.
and the acceptance of the diversity. The first time I had something at our house for your dad when he first ran for Congress, and I invited people in the neighborhood, and the turnout was pretty good. And somebody said to me, Elaine, your lawn's going to be trashed for doing this. I said, well, we'll see. And the next morning I went out, and I never knew how people got toilet paper draped in the trees. I never knew they threw a roll of toilet paper and found a roll of toilet paper. Whoever threw it didn't work. And almost the whole roll was on the grass.
Didn't know what they were doing.
No.
But that was the only real
Oh,
consequence.
as I say, the greatest consequences, I think, were when I supported Maynard. I think that's when people got my MO. So I've been very lucky and I've been very judicious. Miles supported Bill Campbell and I didn't. I actively didn't. And so people tend to listen to me now.
Shirley's campaign.
Both of them, yeah.
And then you were active in Kasim's campaign.
Co-chaired that campaign too.
Yeah. So how'd you come to that decision?
Because I was so unhappy when Shirley told me, her met, to be her campaign manager. Shirley, how could you do this? This is someone I've never heard of. He couldn't have any idea of the political Atlanta, the whole of Atlanta. I don't care if he knows his own Senate district. He doesn't know Atlanta. I was really upset. So at the beginning of the campaign, and Shirley kept saying, Elaine, don't worry, he's going to be fine, you know how she does. I started going down to the campaign office 3 times a week or more, and watched Kasim work, and watched how he dealt with people, and he dealt with problems, and his whole demeanor. By the end of the campaign, I was so taken with his potential, I said to him, I'm going on the record now. Anytime you want me to do anything for you in a political race, let me know. I'm ready. And then 8 years later, he asked me to co-chair his campaign. He said, will you do for me what you did for Shirley? And I said, I won't come down to the office that often.
Yes, so some of the threads of...
I think that the greatest difference probably is in the general expectation of political leadership. That was just an inconceivable idea. Sam's campaign. It was Sam's campaign. Yes, and that's why I stopped speaking to him, too. He had billboards saying Atlanta City Too Young to Die. And people really believed that. It would be a death knell. And it was painful to watch the reluctance of the white community to give up political power.
Why did you feel differently?
I don't know. Well, I was talking to Harvey about this. I really and truly don't know. I never understood racism. It just didn't equate with my emotions. And the reason I went to work in Maine in Senate campaign was because I wrote a very legitimate letter of complaint to Herman Talmadge. I don't even remember what it was about, but I agonized over it. Back then, I thought writing a letter to the United States Senator was probably the most important thing I could ever do in my life. And I labored over this handwritten letter, and I checked it for punctuation and spelling and everything, which is really makes it even funnier that I can't remember what my complaint was. And I got back from him this, what they call the bedbug letter, the form letter to everyone who writes a complaint. Nothing pertaining to what I wrote about. And I was so angry that I hadn't been paid attention to, that when Maynard called and told Miles he was going to run for mayor, I said, I'm on board.
How did they know each other?
Lawyers. I told Harvey the first time I met Maynard, which was at a DeKalb County Democratic Party do, not knowing a lot of people. And I said to Elliot, who is that Puerto Rican Oxford-sounding man over there? That was the first time I met Maynard.
Not too totally understandable.
Or his number.
Step back and assess the contribution of the city's leadership. How would you describe it? What assessment would you put on it?
I would have to say that it has truly been immeasurable because of the people in leadership positions or moving into leadership positions. And as far as the corporations go, just knowing, I'm not sure if it's still the same way now as it was then, but the corporations knew that they had a better chance getting their nominee in if it was either a woman or a person of color. And that changed the culture and the attitude, I think, of a lot of people. Very gentle, unassuming way. I mean, that's just the way it was. And I think that the individual things like my Bill Bowling stories, that of course adds tremendously to it. But I think it's the underlying emotional philosophy of leadership.
Race Day?
No, that came in my year. It was Charles King. Have you heard about him?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
He's a legend.
Oh, he is a legend. Leadership Atlanta had him present his race seminar to my class, and it was in October of 1976. And I was so upset with him because he truly believed, and now I think he may be right, that everybody is racist in some way. And he would present all of these scenarios, and which would you choose? And of course the whites would always choose one and the blacks would choose the other. And he tried to convince me that I was a racist. And I fought with him for the entire day. So much so that 2 other people in my class, and I went out to his place on Ashby Street that Saturday and spent the better part of the day arguing with him. That man taught me so much. He really and truly did. He made tremendous change in a lot of people. He certainly made a change in me, who thought I needed no change, but I clearly did. And one of the most memorable things for me with Charles was my skin, and then I'd point to your hand and say, and that's the color of your skin, and we are different.
So you kept, did he do it the whole time you
He
were?
did it until he began to be ill, and then he told me that he couldn't get, when I called him about the next year, he said that he couldn't promise, and I better find somebody else. And he recommended a few people to me. CT didn't do the program while I was there.
Okay.
He did it later. There was somebody who was a divinity professor at Emory named Thee Smith. CT did not do it while I was there.
I think, it's still, was there ever any assessment of that, of the impact of the race
Oh, yeah.
discussion?
We started doing evaluations of programs and then evaluations at the end of, don't remember the exact numbers, but the majority.
About their Leadership Atlanta experience, still the...
Yeah. And it's very, very interesting. Pearl Clegg said to me, because she knew me, she said, I spend my life apologizing to white people for what black people are. I'm not going to sit through this. I'm never coming to Leadership Atlanta again. She was gone. Shirley was offended by the program too.
The thing that really impressed me was that, and son is doing it.
Yes, I know.
Under my opinion, that because I spent it, first I was just sort of bored because I didn't think there was anything for me to learn. And,
I think that's why Shirley left with Charles.
But realized that, you do.
And then, of course, I don't know if they still do, and they do, they make it, stretch it out over a longer period now. Ours was a day-long program.
Yeah, ours was 2 days.
And we started bringing sexism into the program and all of the other isms, and just trying to make people generally more aware and sensitive to people that didn't look, act, and
The interesting thing with my small group was that the Jeremiah Wright story broke. White members of my study group said that they would not be able to even consider what was going on with the Jeremiah Wright situation if they hadn't demonized him and moved on, and not even consider context involved or whether there was a mission to have a discussion about it. If they had.
My greatest failure, and it was an abject failure, with Leadership Atlanta. Watts riots occurred during a fall retreat, and we had breakout groups, and we had different questions for each group. And I didn't have the good sense or the flexibility to change the breakout groups to relate to the Watts riots that everybody was talking about. And that could have been such a learning experience, and it wasn't.
The questions that we like to pose to the people with whom we have conversations has to do with what's made Atlanta different. What are what would you identify as characteristics of an Atlanta way that might be different from Boston or other places that we've
Well, this is something I have thought about, and I am absolutely convinced that the growth in population and the change of demos has contributed to it, because the growth of Atlanta in the late 60s and the 70s, so huge, people coming from all over. They came with some baggage, of course, we all do, but found that it didn't work. This was a new city, new things were happening, and people wanted to become involved. They had to decide how they wanted things to work. And I think that it was the new blood that established a sense of possibility for the city of Atlanta. No other city that I know of. Certainly not Boston.
I agree with you. I think that's one of the characteristics of Atlanta as a relatively young city and a crossroads city, transportation, heritage, and so on, that it's been welcoming to visitors in ways that other southern cities certainly did not do. And yet you could come here, you could be accepted for your role in the city's life and development from whatever background. And that's in pretty marked contrast to Charleston or some of the other places around. Drive the lineage question even in Boston. It's certainly deeply rooted in many.
Well, I told Harvey the story when we first came to Atlanta. I was so delighted because instead of people asking me what my parents' name was, what my grandparents' name were, they'd just say, "Where are you from?" And I was there. It was just me. It wasn't generations in back of me.
We usually have a student. We usually have the students to ask this question, but one of the things we hope is that this becomes looking at kind of how Atlanta has evolved, but then also, what do they need to be careful to protect and to exercise in terms of leadership. So what?
Well, my mantra has always been the power of one. And I firmly believe that if someone recognizes a need for change, that the power of one in implementing that change is imperative. And that's what creates a vested interest in your community.
So how can Atlanta sustain its traditions of people coming together? What do we need of?
I wish there was some way that we could celebrate differences rather than just creating cookie cutter groups. Again, I guess this is the lens of diversity, but in all things, not just skin color or ethnic heritage, I think that if we had a mantra of celebrating differences and bringing those differences together to listen and learn, that could be what Atlanta becomes known for. I think it would be a dream come true.
Very deeply appreciative.
Well, I am deeply appreciative of you wanting to talk to me about this. It's been a wonderful time to be in the city. It really has.
It's wonderful because people like you have made that investment.
Because people like me didn't know we couldn't. Really.
We have to continue to inspire people to understand this kind of civic engagement and why it's so critical.
Oh, it is. Go around. The world that I want to be in, at least.